Now, without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our first speaker this morning, Congressman Rush Holt. Rush almost doesn't need an introduction. He's a legend in Congress. He is the only academic physicist in the U.S. Congress. He's actually, I think, the only scientist with a PhD in the U.S. Congress. We have a few MDs, but he's the only scientist. And he represents my district, which is the 12th district of the state of New Jersey. And Rush has served with incredible distinction for many years. And this is his last year as congressman. He is stepping down from this position. And he's a very active interest in many things that are of concern to all of us. But I've asked him today to come to talk to us, and he comes to this university often, but I've asked him today to come to talk to us about his thoughts about energy. So without further ado, Rush, I think you're on. Thank you very, very much for coming. You don't need this. You don't need the PowerPoint.
No, I don't need that. Thank you.
So,
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
In fact, I'll close that so I don't. Well, good morning. Thank you, Paul, and the organizers for putting this continuing discussion. This is the, did you say 8th annual? 9th annual. Thank you for including me in it. You have a great group of speakers today. I'm going to stay to take part in the discussion as long as I can. I wanted to start with a few remarks that, well, may or may not be useful in setting the context for the day. You probably are much more interested in hearing the technical rather than policy presentations today. But I wanted to talk about what is presented in the poster as energy change in a reluctant country, or seeking a changed climate for climate change. It's great to be here. Rutgers does such good things, and especially in this program. And Paul, well, I certainly commend him for his national role in climate matters and energy matters. I wanted to share a few things about the environment in which I work. Now, most of my work is in the towns among 750,000 people whom I represent here in New Jersey. But part of my job, of course, is to carry their hopes, dreams, aspirations, and represent those things in the U.S. Congress. And here are a few things that my colleagues in Washington have recently said on the topic of climate change. One member of the Senate said, "The notion that man-made gases, anthropogenic," that's a big word for politicians to use, "anthropogenic gases, CO2, cause global warming is probably the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people." One congressman, when presented at a hearing with evidence of global warming, suggested, is there some thought being given to subsidizing the clearing of rainforests in order for some countries to eliminate that production of greenhouse gases? Now, as many of you recall, Mitt Romney, in his speech accepting the presidential nomination of his party in 2012, used climate change as a laugh line. He said, "President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans," and the crowd laughed. "And," he continued, "to heal the planet," and the crowd laughed harder. So these illustrate a mindset that is increasingly widespread and increasingly politicized. Just a few years before those remarks by Romney, it was possible for anyone in any political party to accept the reality of climate change. George W. Bush said he believed in human-induced, I don't think he used the word anthropogenic, but human-induced climate change. And so did John McCain, who during the 2008 campaign for president called for a kind of cap and trade on greenhouse gases. But it is increasingly difficult now to present this without a political tag attached. It is generally believed, it is generally demanded, in fact, that those who speak about climate change as a problem to be dealt with are Democrats, and those who deny it are Republicans. The climate change is now, like gun control and abortion, becoming a litmus test issue. It's driven as much by political affiliation and political ideology as by consideration of the facts. Let's look at some of the opinion polls. 8 years ago, the Pew Research Center asked in a poll whether solid evidence exists that the Earth is warming. Now, without more probing questions about the role of carbon or other such things, 77% said yes. This is of the general public. When asked the same question last year, only 67% said. Now, obviously, it's not quite clear what these questions mean, but this is the same polling organization, the same methodology. There's a clear drop-off, in this case of roughly a dozen points. In itself, that's, I think, an extraordinary fact. So over the last few years, as the evidence for climate change has grown more and more overwhelming, doubt about the nature of climate change has grown, doubt about the effects and doubts about the role of carbon and the role of human activities has grown. It's even the case that fewer Americans believe it exists at all. And the numbers become even starker when you look at the partisan breakdown. In 2006, 91% of Democrats believed, whatever that means, in global warming. The same polling methodology 7 years later, 2013, so 2 years ago, or a year or so ago, the number was 88%, essentially unchanged within the poll's margin of error. Among Republicans, belief in global warming fell from 59%, already markedly lower, some years ago, markedly lower than among Democrats, but fell to 50%. And among independents, the belief plummeted from 79 to 62%. And here's something I find perhaps even more alarming. It turns out that if you're a Democrat, more education makes you more likely to believe in human-induced climate change. 86% of college-educated Democrats believe that, as opposed to 57% of non-college graduates. But for Republicans, education makes almost no difference. 28% of college grads believe in man-made climate change, as opposed to 23% of non-college grads. So maybe this is obvious to all of you. The evidence for human-induced climate change is overwhelming. It's real. Humans are in large part responsible for changes we see from the stratosphere to the mountain peaks, to the drought-ravaged breadbaskets, to the oceans. And that's not really subject for extensive debate. It is being reworked and reworked, as scientists should and scientists do. But it is not being examined for its truthfulness. In today's toxic political climate, these obvious truths, and of course I use that with reservedly. Any of you philosophers of science understand that truth is a slippery concept, but the obvious truths are being overwhelmed by affinity politics. And more information doesn't seem to change the beliefs of the skeptics. It makes them use their knowledge, their argumentative skills more creatively to advance their ideologies. Just dig their heels in. Now, I experienced this for myself last year when I was engaged in a statewide campaign here in New Jersey, and I released a video. I had a number of brief, kind of 15-second and 60-second videos. I was pretty proud of those, actually. One of them dealt with climate change. And I said, face to camera, if we don't act, millions could die. Well, the response was rather strong. You know, it's not a particularly controversial statement in the scientific community. The World Health Organization estimates that 150,000 additional people already die each year due to climate change, mostly in poor nations, from climate-sensitive causes, malnutrition, diseases, and so forth. The 20-nation Climate Vulnerable Forum examined a broader set of risks and concluded that 400,000 are already dying each year. So to say that millions will die if we don't do anything is not so controversial in the scientific and public health community. Obviously, they're just estimates. People of goodwill can disagree about the exact numbers, but the underlying truth is real. If we fail to act, millions will die. Well, not everyone agreed with me, but worse than that, one opponent in the race accused me of silly hysteria. The news media refused to take a side, you know, as has been the case in many climate change issues. Well, on the one hand, and on the other hand, well, we couldn't get 99% of the scientists here on the stage, so we have one representing those 99% of the scientists, and then we have somebody representing that other 1%, so we can have balance. So anyway, the news media refused to take a side, and one headline on the controversy said that Holt defended his claims. One radio station had a poll. Rush Holt claims millions will die due to climate change. Do you buy that? As if that was the determination, the way to decide, the way to get to the bottom of it. You know, that. So anyway, I didn't need to be reminded, but it was a reminder that what we say is not always being seen through the lens of accuracy or inaccuracy, but the lens of affinity, ideology, or identity. To many Republicans, my remarks were seen as a personal affront, an attack on their personal beliefs. And it was offensive and hysterical. Well, we need to change the climate. We need to change the climate for debate here in this country. It wasn't very long ago, it was well within the memory of most of the people in this room, where it was clear that gay people should not be allowed to marry. It was not just unacceptable, it was beyond discussion in most situations. Very few politicians advocated it, and those who did were dismissed as radicals. How times have changed. Americans started seeing gay characters in the media, movies and TV shows, and began to see them in their families and daily lives. Some states started passing laws recognizing domestic partnerships. The sky didn't fall. Massachusetts allowed gay marriage. The sky didn't fall. And now we are approaching, we have 17 states with gay marriage. The president has endorsed the idea, and it's certainly growing. The battle is still a battle, but it's gone from being unthinkable to an everyday part of American life through personal experience. It's been the result of thoughtful and diligent advocacy by the LGBT community, by bravely seeking more and more recognition and respect year after year. These advocates have slowly changed the minds of the nation. But even more, I would argue, it is personal familiarity that has changed this. A critical mass of out gays and out couples that have brought the issue home. I think we're going to have to see that in climate change as well. A few years ago, it was not only acceptable to say that the climate was changing, it was considered a serious issue for discussion. But because of relentless denialism and really expensive disinformation campaigns and a constant drumbeat of a false controversy, to accept climate change today is almost impolitic. It is not on the agenda at all in Washington. It's not as if, well, we'll hold some hearings and see if we can get to a consensus. No, it is in the House dismissed by the leadership as beyond the pale, not suitable for Thanksgiving table discussion. And if those who live in the Fox News bubble, discussions of climate change are seen as ludicrous. So we need to help people recognize that they do know climate change personally. It has reached their family and their daily lives. I refer you to the National Climate Assessment that was released by the White House at 8:30 this morning. So it hasn't yet reached your, well, it's probably reached your, those of you who have your laptops and personal phones open. I refer you to that. I think they are taking a good approach. They are trying to make this issue relevant to you if you live in the Northeast, if you live in the Midwest, if you live in the South, if you live in Hawaii even. They are talking about, in the Northeast, more extreme precipitation and coastal flooding. Oh yeah, I remember that. We did have some experience with that. You can hear people around the state saying. In the Midwest, although there may be some enhanced photosynthetic activity because of more CO2 concentration, that will be more than offset by heat and drought and floods. And you can hear people up and down the Mississippi say, oh yeah, I remember when the barges ran aground on the Mississippi. I remember our wilted, stunted corn stalks. And then they go on to say, and snowpack in the West will create water shortage. And you can hear people, driving out to Mammoth or someplace saying, oh yeah, that's right, they closed the snow slopes this year, didn't they? They may not yet be ready to accept that millions will die because of changes in food and water and temperature, that world health will be affected by changes in habitats for disease vectors, the Anopheles mosquito or whatever. But I think they are taking the right approach in the White House to put these in familiar terms, which I think will be necessary. Now, scientists, of course, can help. Scientists pride ourselves on evidence-based thinking. We've all bought into a culture where evidence trumps. Evidence trumps ideology. It's not to say that any one of us in any of our fields can't think of examples where an interesting idea was dismissed as outlandish. We just weren't ready for it yet, and eventually it came to be true. Nevertheless, we all buy into the pledge that we will keep our mind open to a letter that comes from a patent clerk in Switzerland saying that everything we think we know about space, time, and length needs to be rethought. It is indeed the very foundation of the scientific process. Now, I'm not sure how quickly we can communicate this scientific way of thinking, making decisions in a way that they can be answered empirically and verifiably. That's how I define science. It's a system for asking questions so that they can be answered empirically and verifiably. I don't think you need a more complete definition of science than that. I don't think you can find a more complete definition of science than that. I'm not sure how quickly we can communicate this way of thinking to the general public, but we have to work at it. We have to make sure that people understand that scientists aren't necessarily wiser than anyone else, but that we've honed a number of practical, of useful practices of mind, statistical reasoning, being alert to the fallibility of experts and authorities, remaining alert to the mental tricks that we humans play on ourselves, and a willingness ultimately to listen to the evidence. And we believe that despite statistical uncertainty and occasional fallacious thinking, there is progress. It may be a slowly converging series toward the truth, but scientists actually have a sense of progress that lawyers and legislators and the general public don't have. Lawyers and legislators are looking for temporary balances of interests, where the balance will last as long as the interested parties are around. And that's not bad. There's some genius in our Constitution in allowing that to happen. But it's not a progressive mentality. And so that makes it hard for people who are not scientists to think in longer terms about, well, okay, what happens to the Earth 10, 50, 100, 200 years from now? And who cares? It's not the immediate balance of interests that is that's under discussion there. I won't go on at length about this subject, but I would challenge any scientists in the audience to think about how they can communicate this scientific way of thinking to people so that they could begin to understand how we could be so comfortable with the uncertainty about the mechanisms of how fast a great glacier will go to sea or melt entirely. How we can be so comfortable with indirect proxy measurements of temperature changes and draw such, they would say, excessive conclusions from, well, as Mark Twain says, from such trifling investments in fact. It has worked for science, and people can understand that it has worked for science, but they can't quite bring themselves to enter that way of thinking. I would challenge you to help them find ways to do that. But meanwhile, while we're approaching that golden age where every well-informed, well-educated person can think constructively and comfortably about science and think about evidence like a scientist, I would urge you to remind them to get familiar, to get close and personal with climate change. And I think they will begin to understand what's at stake, the importance of it, and why we should act as best we know how, even with uncertainty. Thanks. Did you want me to stay up here? Okay, all right. Sure, you're not going to be here for. I can stay for a while.
So
yeah.
Rush.
No, I'm eager to stay for a while. You have some fine presenters. I want to hear.
Why don't you sit down if you're standing, and then we'll.
Yeah, there are a lot of seats.
A lot of
Yeah,
seats. Please come down
on in.
and sit. We can take some questions.
Would you like me to elaborate or explain anything I said, or comment on politics in New Jersey and or anything else?
So this
Thank
is
you.
Alan Robach.
Yes, good to see you, Alan. Yes.
Hold on, use the mic.
There's a
Whoa.
there's a well-funded disinformation campaign that we're fighting against.
Yes,
How do we
yes.
deal with that?
Yeah, it took a lot of us, I think, a long time to recognize that. I think many of us were astonished at the turnaround from, after the Al Gore film, there really was a high level of concern, widely spread, not, even beyond people who had seen the film. And suddenly that turned around, and a lot of us were mystified by it until some researchers actually started putting together the media buys, the data about the media buys. And you could see that Koch brothers and others, and energy companies and others, were spending a lot of money planting seeds of doubt. Well, we've seen this before. Roughly 30 years ago, the tobacco industry spent billions of dollars planting seeds of doubt, saying, well, the scientists are claiming that smoking causes cancer, but surely you know somebody who's 88 years old and has smoked all of her life. And we'll say, oh yeah, Aunt Tilly, yeah, she did. So the ad or the disinformation goes on. So you see, it can't cause cancer. And they were really quite successful in preventing any anti-tobacco legislation, any anti-cancer campaigns from getting any traction for many years until they were exposed in their mendacity and cruelty. Henry Waxman took these executives, swore them in as witnesses in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and asked one tobacco executive after another, point blank, some questions that without perjury they couldn't dodge. and blew the whole thing open. And it made a huge difference in public health. So I suppose at some point we're going to have to confront some of the mendacious organizers of this disinformation campaign. But meanwhile, I still think we've got to kind of work around that a little bit and overcome their disinformation by reminding people that just as, you know, they know gays who are just fine as couples, so too, they know climate change and can't deny it. Bob, hi.
Thank you so much. So I really try hard not to be a cynic.
I'm sorry?
I say I really try hard not to be a cynic, but I'm remembering a visit that we had here some years ago by a high official within the U.S. Navy. And this was a project that stretched back into at least the latter Bush administration, if not the one before that, in which the Navy was planning very carefully for what it was going to do about climate change and sea level rise.
Yeah.
While the very government, the administration of that Navy, was in complete denial. Help us overcome the tendency to being cynical about our government from your perspective in light of that one example, of which I'm sure there are thousands.
Well, you know, when people ask me, isn't it frustrating to work in Washington? I will admit to occasional frustration. For the most part, it has been a very satisfying undertaking for me. But what I retreat to often is history. You know, this country has not done so well by accident. We've done well, I would argue, principally because of our representative government. The people have time and again gotten their representatives back on track, sometimes by change of personnel, sometimes by other pressure and influence. And tobacco regulation is a case in point. I mean, we were poisoning hundreds of thousands of people every year to death. That has changed. It's changed dramatically, and the social behavior followed. You know, I really don't want to minimize the influence of the federal government. Not just in, you know, I mean, when we passed the Civil Rights Act, that changed the kind of human behavior that it was believed could not be changed by law. You know, civil rights laws can't make you like black people, it was said. But society has changed enormously, and you can trace it back to the civil rights laws. Similarly in economics, we have not yet won the debate that federal investment in research, federal investment in science, is the leading indicator, not the trailing indicator. That is what leads corporations and businesses to change their practices. Not just because of the fruits of the federally funded research, but because of the competition that is set up by the federally funded research. And there's an interesting book out recently that I was just reading over the weekend by Maria Mazzucato, who grew up here in New Jersey but works in Great Britain now. called the entrepreneurial state, making the point that even such examples as the iPhone can be, which are thought of as kind of the prime example of individual entrepreneurism, really have their roots in federally funded, federally determined research. So that if you're looking for new energy technologies, if you're looking for an understanding of climate measures, if you're looking for kind of any of these things related to this, there are things that can be done from the federal level and can best be done from the federal level. So everything I'm saying about changing public opinion is directed toward my, or derives from my belief that this will in turn change the behavior of our representative government. This quick turnaround in acceptance of climate change and interest in climate change over the last few years because of the disinformation was reflected immediately in Congress. People who had been talking somewhat about climate change stopped talking about it. It had been on the agenda at least a little bit. I mean, we came close to passing an energy and climate bill in Congress. I mean, the House passed it, Senate couldn't, but at least it was very much in the mix. It's just gone from the agenda. So the point is, our government, the federal government, is very responsive, not necessarily on a time scale we would like. In this case, it was on a time scale we don't like. It was very quickly. It can be quick. It can also be very long, but it is, historically, it almost always happens. Very long answer, but it maybe puts my remarks in some perspective there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Rush. You'll stay around.
I'll stay around. We can talk at the coffee hour. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah.